So as that introduction graciously explained, I do have quite a few thoughts about purity culture as a researcher, as a feminist Christian, as a psychologist. I've dedicated the last 5 years of my life to researching purity culture, but I also really have a passion for navigating all of the tensions that it brings up, because it's not always as simple as just throwing everything out with the purity culture in a sense. And so I have a lot that I want to go over today. It's going to be a really big, I guess, like 50,000-foot view of purity culture. I tried my best to get my 200-page dissertation and 5 years of research into 35 minutes, but I think it's best if I just do an overview and leave a lot of time for discussion. So that's my plan for today, but I first want to start by just seeing where everyone is at and how familiar they are or what their associations might be with purity culture. So for that, I want to get a sense of what everyone's purity culture associations are. And I am going to get, I'm going to get tricky here for a second and switch it to a Mentimeter, where I'd love for you all you can use your phones and go to menti.com and then type in this code right here, 68903661. And send in your associations that you might have with purity culture. It could be one word, it could be a couple words, and it's going to form a word cloud here, because I think depending on your faith tradition, how maybe old or young you were when you came into Christianity, your nationality, your gender, and even your generation, you might all have different impressions of purity culture. So I'd love to get those. There's some coming in. Abstinence, guilt, heteronormativity, harmful, repression, damaged goods. That's a phrase that gets used quite a bit. Shame, toxic, waiting till marriage. Oh, they're flooding in now. Lots of dating rules, power, promise rings, modest dressing, disillusioned, junior high, abstinence pledges, hidden, uptight, fear, submissive. There's a sense here where I'm getting memories people have of specific things or activities they did. Phrases are sticking out, but I'm also seeing a lot of emotions or internal experiences: shame, hurt, guilt, repression, power. And yeah, it looks like waiting till marriage and shame and abstinence are the three biggest ones right now. Guilt's growing up there, but I think that goes to show that two of the more content definitions of purity culture, abstinence and waiting till marriage, are just as associated with purity culture as shame and guilt. That's one of the things that drove me to this. So I'm grateful to you all for chiming in, hearing what you all associate with purity culture. I'm going to jump back to my presentation. And something that I think is important to acknowledge as we embark on this today is that everyone's experiences with purity culture are valid in their own way. For some people, it was not that traumatic and things went fine. And for other people, this was a huge wound, a huge religious trauma, and caused a lot of systemic damage for them as well. So we're going to explore all of those possible outcomes today. Very quickly, an overview of what purity culture is. The fact that you all chimed in and you're here today, you're part of the Westmont community, I'm assuming a general awareness of purity culture, but as a reminder, it was a movement, especially popular in the 90s and 2000s in American evangelical Christianity, that really hyped up the importance of waiting until marriage. Even that phrase is kind of vague, but essentially it was about controlling your sexuality until you were in a heterosexual marriage. And I want to break this down though, because my study of purity culture is a religio-social model. So I'm not looking at this primarily from a theological lens. I'm looking at it from a social psychological lens as kind of a subculture. So what else is going on with purity culture besides just this theological idea that it's important to save sexuality for marriage? There's much more baked into purity culture. First off is complementarianism. So this is the theology that posits that the gender binary is essential, meaning you are born with these gender stereotyped traits, and that there was a design in place that God wanted men and women to be inherently different from one another and to have different roles in the family, in society, and in relationships. And purity culture resources during this time really emphasized complementarianism in the way that they set up men and women having vastly different struggles with their sexuality, vastly different issues in their romantic relationships. There's a huge reliance on complementarianism in the rhetoric of purity culture. So it's important to acknowledge that. In my research, I also examined the individualism that's really present in purity culture. There's been some sociological studies done of what happens when purity culture books were shipped to missionaries in other cultures. And it's actually interesting that they are adapted quite differently. Americans love individual freedom. We love individual responsibility, self-regulation, and just an emphasis on our individual sacrifice and outcomes. That's something I'll speak on a little bit later, that purity culture really in America had a sense that it needed to sell itself. So there's also a lot of rhetoric that some of you might be familiar with in terms of why it's worth it to wait till marriage. There's a sense of we're not just doing it because God asked, it's because there's actually going to be all these other benefits. And so there's this idea of individual sacrifice or investment reaps positive outcomes for your later adult life. Someone in the word cloud mentioned heteronormativity. That's important to note right off the bat, is along with complementarianism, purity culture is really set up to, in a way, idolize straight relationships, which can leave a lot of our LGBTQ siblings in Christ and single individuals, really leaves them out of the narrative in a way that is not very reflective of the church's history. We'll talk about that more in a bit for the people who have been left out of this very strict view of what a good Christian life is. And finally, I put down here counterculture. Purity culture really liked to think of itself as quite countercultural. It was a reaction to the rising sex positive media happening in the 90s and 2000s. And so purity culture was really trying to be this social correction to the loosening limits of women's sexual freedom. But as we'll talk about, there's actually quite a few cultural values from American culture, Western culture, such as patriarchy, heteronormativity, capitalism, rape culture. There's a lot of larger cultural values that purity culture is still reinforcing. As much as they wanted to be revolutionary, there's still quite a lot of repetitiveness in how they approached cultural issues. My research really focuses on the unintended side effects of purity culture. I try to have an empathetic view of, at at its heart, what were people in the purity culture movement wanting to accomplish? They were wanting to create strong relationships, avoid anxiety, avoid uncertainty, avoid the messiness of relationships by giving really strict rules. But longitudinal research shows it didn't really work. So if purity culture's one goal was to help people save all of their sexual activity until marriage, they really didn't reach it. The best possible interpretation of purity culture outcomes is that on average, people who signed a purity pledge delayed their first time having sex by about 18 months, but it had nothing to do with if they were married or not. So it didn't reach its goal, and it also had unintended negative side effects. So some of these I've listed here. I've already mentioned the devaluing of single and LGBTQ plus experiences. There's quite a bit of shame and anxiety, as many of you put in the word cloud. The way that sex is talked about is really fear-based or risk-oriented, leaving many people with a lot of anxiety about their sexuality or shame if they've already had sex or, explored their sexuality in another way. The commodification of virginity is also a really important thing to note. So in this PowerPoint, I'm using a lot of flower and wedding imagery, a little bit tongue in cheek, because there's a lot of metaphors that you all might be familiar with that purity culture uses, where virginity, specifically a young woman's virginity, is tied directly to an object of value that gets ruined. A beautiful flower that gets smashed, a gift that gets opened, a piece of gum that gets chewed. And in the desire to talk about the importance of waiting until marriage, virginity gets boiled down to this commodity that you trade in a sense, for a good relationship. And that's a whole nother topic in terms of the construct of virginity, how it's based in patriarchy. I don't have time to unpack all of that, but just know not only is purity culture buying into the myth of virginity, they're commodifying it too. I think it's important to also note how purity culture in the 90s and 2000s really emphasized sexuality and sexual ethic to such a degree that a person's relationship to God and their sense of morality really ended up getting tied to sexuality. So that became the best marker of how good is your relationship with God? How good a Christian are you? How important is this to your identity? Sexuality kind of became the symbol or the material in which to sort out our faith identity. I think it's also important to acknowledge that purity culture created a lot of victim blaming. I have some research and resources that I'll share at the end for anyone wanting to learn more about this. But the way that the church spiritualized all sexuality created a lot of power imbalances and a lot of misconceptions about sexual assault and sexual abuse. It kind of covered everything under the umbrella of sexual sin, which some researchers have called sin leveling. So abuses of power and acts of violence are then categorized in sexual sin, and both people are held accountable for it, which can be really damaging. And so that's a very important unintended side effect to grapple with in a post-purity culture world. And finally, it's important to acknowledge that purity culture just in general resulted in a lot of lacking sex education. So purity culture was in this dilemma where they don't want to tell you too much information or that gets too tempting. So there's a lot of metaphors, there's a lot of reading between the lines, and there's a lot of lack of understanding of sexuality, sexual acts, what is normal, how do our bodies work. And research shows that most people who signed a purity pledge were not able to articulate what sex was or what they were promising not to do. And research has also shown that people who signed purity pledges are more likely to do risky sexual behaviors later on in life. And that's not necessarily because they are so mad at purity culture that they're going out and taking a whole bunch of risks. A lot of the times it's because they don't know what are risky behaviors, such as not using protection, things like that. They don't have that education to make more informed decisions. So what was meant to be a system that would protect youth from being over-sexualized, exposed to sexual health risks, and keep them from feeling, anxiety and shame, ended up in a sense causing all of those things, unfortunately. I want to really quick mention the background influences because, like I said, this is not just an issue of theology. This is a sociocultural movement that's specific to American evangelicalism and its individualism. It's related to traditional gender roles. That's why I've got this stereotypical housewife up there. It's related to political forces, the moral majority, and a lot of political and economic pieces that were at play at who was funding abstinence-only education, what purpose was this serving politically, in terms of furthering the narrative that the only safe way to have sex or teach teens about sex was to teach abstinence. So that's the focus on the family, shout out there. And like I've mentioned already, it is a reaction to the more sex positive or hypersexualization of women in the 90s and 2000s. There's a variety of opinions of if that was a helpful feminist step or if that is objectifying, but overall there was this big swell of women being able to be more sexual in media without huge amounts of judgment, and purity culture was really a reactionary movement to that. So again, I want to emphasize that purity culture is a social movement that's tied up with issues of faith and theology, but is not just faith and theology. So in my remaining time tonight, I hope to discuss 3 common responses that I've seen as a researcher, as a evangelical myself who grew up during this time, and as a therapist. These are 3 common responses or common themes that I see in this kind of post-purity culture world that we're in. The first is those who followed purity culture. For many people, it's maybe it was challenging, but it was worth it. They went along with the program. It made sense to them. They have a happy relationship, maybe, and that is a valid outcome for many people. But for others, they are really reacting against purity culture. They're really hurt and angry with all of those harmful side effects we discussed, and a lot of their choices, both in their sexual decision making and in how they think about their faith and religion, are a reaction to the ways that purity culture harmed them or was negative overall. And finally, those who are excluded by purity culture. I think for a while, I was in this camp in college. I was just having a good time. I wasn't necessarily wanting to be in a serious relationship yet. And there's a sense where purity culture is so fixated on sexuality and marriage and dating that for many people, it doesn't always fit or feel relevant. And then that's especially heightened for people who are not within the gender binary heteronormativity that purity culture is promoting. And so, of course, these aren't the only three narratives following an upbringing that had purity culture in it, but these are three of the kind of common camps that I see. And I'd like to walk you through my observations with them before we get to a time of discussion and questions. So first is following purity culture. Those who went along with the program, like I said, it can still have many positive outcomes for them, but what I've observed in my research and in my clinical work is that there tends to be a disengagement with either one's own body or one's community. It can be really hard to completely sequester your sexuality off and split it off from yourself until you're ready to make the commitment of marriage. And so that usually leads to having to disconnect or disown your own sexuality and body, or you don't do that and you feel like you have, in a sense, a secret life of watching porn, masturbating, doing things with your partner that you later feel really bad about, feel like you can't talk to your church community about. So I often see that something has to give in a sense, and there's either this split with your own self and body and sexuality, or a split with community where you feel like you kind of have to put a mask on. This leads to feeling trapped or conflicted. I've seen this as well for people who follow purity culture. They can feel really stuck within these narrow confines of what's expected from their Christian life. They might have conflicted feelings. They also have a difficult time as well making such a rapid switch once married. That's something that many Christian therapists see, is that it's really just not very realistic to shut down your sexuality entirely and then expect yourself to be totally fine once you're married. I think one big loss for those following purity culture as well is, even if it worked for them and for their partner and spouse, they are living with a limited definition of what the image of a faithful life as a Christian could be. So if purity culture worked for you and you're not experiencing any of these big side effects, I feel happy for you, but also you're going to have to go the extra step to explore what life is like for those siblings in Christ you have who didn't follow that same path or were not able to follow that same path. There's kind of a blinder effect, or like a tunnel vision effect, that purity culture can give to people. And that can lead them, even if they're not meaning to be really exclusionary in their sense of Christian community and life. Finally, a really important downside of following purity culture, just like the last point, even if this worked for you, you may be perpetuating a system that is still hurtful to others, specifically in making it difficult for victims to ask for help. So in the way that you are using purity culture rhetoric to talk about your value on waiting until marriage, in the way that you are talking about how great it was that you made that decision, you might unintentionally be contributing to feelings of shame that victims of sexual abuse have experienced, and you may have made it more difficult for them to ask for help. Again, it's not that you're trying to do this, but it's just blind spots that purity culture creates, even if it worked for you. The second path that I'd say is probably the most common these days, or the most that I see, at least in my practice, is reacting against purity culture. So this is coming from a place of being upset with purity culture, and in many ways rightfully so. We've talked about a lot of the harmful values and unintended side effects that got baked in and twisted up in this more theological topic, and it can be hard to untangle all of that. So like I already mentioned, it can lead to increased health risks where you feel like I was raised in purity culture, now I don't want to follow it anymore, but you're lacking sexual education, so you might be taking more risks than you know you are. It leads to that sense of faith deconstruction as well. A lot of times when our faith life has been so wrapped up in legalism or patriarchal structures, when we start to challenge those, it can feel really scary to have our whole faith or our whole relationship with God crumble along with them. And that becomes a whole nother journey to walk through. And so many people who critique purity culture also experience that. I think it's also important to acknowledge, this is from my more psychological point of view, when we are upset at something, when we are not wanting to feel shame, it's very normal to try to cancel out that feeling by doing the opposite of what we were told to do. It's a normal thing. We don't want to feel trapped anymore. We don't want to feel shame, but this can lead to us making decisions in our sexuality, in our dating life, in our faith life that are really more about like sticking it to the people we're mad at than doing something that we're actually wanting to do or feeling congruent with our own values and choices. And along with that comes all or nothing thinking. So one of the biggest pieces that I uncover in my research is how purity culture is really entrenched in a system of all or nothing thinking. Stuff is either this or it's that. It's pure or it's impure. It's male or it's female. It's a lot of dichotomies. And when we leave purity culture, we may have a lot of valid criticisms against its damaging systems, but we might still have that all or nothing mindset that makes it hard for us to nuance things out. So we might leave the church, leave purity culture, but still have an all or nothing mindset and approach to the world around us that ends up not being helpful in the long run. And finally, I want to talk about those who are excluded by the purity culture narrative to begin with. This can lead to feeling very isolated. It's hard when your Christian community and your faith community are so fixated on one cultural narrative of purity, marriage, husband, wife, having kids, sexuality. And for anyone not fitting that or not interested in that life, it leads to feeling really on the outside of what Christian community means. It can lead to a lot of questioning of worth. Is there something wrong with me? Am I less of a Christian because I can't or I don't want to follow this roadmap? And just that general lack of roadmap and template to start with. Like I alluded to, this hyperfixation on heteronormative marriage has not always been present in every iteration of the church's history. But right now in the evangelical American Christianity, it is. And so for those of us who don't want a heteronormative marriage, don't want to wait until marriage to explore their sexuality, there can really be a huge gap in how to navigate being a Christian if you don't fit that template. And so those can be really hard side effects. And these are ones that I think really go under the radar for many people. And so these are three possible reactions to purity culture. Like I mentioned, this is a really big picture look at purity culture. I have researched this for 5 years. I'd be happy to answer any more questions in detail for you all, but I wanted to just give a general outline of what purity culture is, what we know influenced it, and then talk about some of the more practical effects of different reactions that people have to purity culture. And so my research then is what now? Because there are plenty of people who have criticized purity culture. From an academic point of view, it is not hard to do. Whether you're coming from a theological, psychological, sociology, or feminist lens, it's pretty easy to poke holes in purity culture. But then what do you do? Because I was seeing a lot of people deconstructing and leaving it at that, at the cathartic release of being like, yes, there was something wrong with that. But then what? As a Christian therapist, I was really wanting to explore, what do we do then? We can't just leave it there. How do we heal? How does the church heal overall? And so I talk in my research about finding equitable ways forward. And so here are a couple ways that I think we can start having those conversations and start going on that journey. I am not repeating what purity culture did by giving you all a step-by-step guideline and just giving you a new cookie cutter framework for how your sexual ethics should be. But these are some action items to get you thinking about how to challenge some of those purity culture assumptions that might have gotten baked into your life or your faith. So the first one is just articulating a more nuanced sexual ethic. Purity culture is really focused on behavior and thought content, and with withholding and restraint. It's a lot focused on what you should not do before marriage. But I think it's important to think about a sexual ethic more widely and in more connection to your larger faith. What does it mean that you're an embodied person, for example? What does it mean that God gave you a body and gave you a sex drive or a sexual orientation or a gender identity? What does it mean in a relationship to be sexual? So thinking not just about what are we allowed and not allowed to do, but how is this part of our overall relationship values? What is it that we're wanting to work towards together? These are more nuanced ways of understanding your sexual ethic, where maybe you'll come to similar conclusions, maybe not, but maybe you'll come to similar conclusions as purity culture, but you're going to get there from a much more rich context where you feel a lot more committed to it because it's based on your values, and that exploration you did in your faith and your relationships rather than a list of do's and don'ts. So I really encourage people to think more broadly and in more nuanced ways about their sexual ethic. I also really think that challenging gender essentialism is important in a post-purity culture church. Like I said, that is kind of the bedrock of purity culture, assuming men are one way, women are another way. It can be pretty upsetting to read how oversimplified the views of both women and men are. In doing my research and reading all of the source material from the 90s and 2000s, found myself being upset because it could be insulting to both men and women, and that's also leaving out our siblings who don't fit those gender binaries. So how can we understand our gender and our gender identity in a way that does not need to rely on this sense of gender essentialism? What does it mean to be a gendered person in the church without just automatically categorizing ourselves into this binary? And I think also an important step for many Christians is to explore how gender essentialism from culture has made its way into our interpretation of faith over time. Along with that, in terms of widening our approach, we also, I think, really need to cultivate a larger imagination for what faithfulness is. Not only is being a quote unquote good or faithful Christian more than just waiting for marriage, being a Christian is far bigger than what are your relationship goals? Are you going to get married? What is your sexual orientation? We need to cultivate a larger imagination for what a good Christian life can be. And finally, we need to decommodify sexuality. I talk a lot about capitalist implications in my research and how in America and American Christianity especially, there was this sense that your sexuality is kind of this present. I mean, it's literally made that explicit in many purity culture things. It's this asset that you get. And if you take good care of it, you'll get to trade it in for a great relationship, both with your future spouse and with God. And I think for us to have more healthy relationships to our sexualities and the sexuality of our partners, we need to untangle that from the idea that our sexuality or our virginity is a commodity that we're trading back and forth. So these are some of my thoughts. I understand that this is a very brief overview, but hopefully these are some things you can all be thinking about as you move forward in your own journeys and in your communities. I wanted to end by just noting that I'm going to be sharing more of my purity culture research and resources on my newly launched Instagram. I've found many spaces online for people who want to deconstruct purity culture, which is great, but there's not always a place where we can talk about, okay, but then what? What's next? Especially for those of us who want to hold on to our faith or look at things in a more nuanced way. So I've got the QR code there that you can all scan. And finally, I wanted to share my favorite resources from when I did my research. So these are all books that are meant for a general audience. It's going to be nothing too nerdy or academic. The best overview book of purity culture that I'd recommend is called Pure by Linda Klein. The best kind of psychological personal wrestling book that I would recommend is Beyond Shame by Matthias Roberts. He is a counselor and a theologian. For those of you who are interested in things from a more sociological perspective, The Purity Myth is one of the most popular books on purity culture that's out there. That's by author Jessica Valenti. She also made a documentary by the same name. And Making Chastity Sexy by Christine Gardner. This is the work of a sociologist who studied how evangelicals really wanted to sell that purity culture was cool. So how they used sexuality to sell abstinence. It's really interesting. If you're interested in gender studies, sociology, media, marketing, ministry, anything like that. For those of you who are wanting a historical or political context for purity culture, Moral Combat is great. It looks at how morality, specifically around sexuality and Christianity, kind of traveled in parallel to certain political, historical, economic agendas in the United States in the 20th century. Finally, for those of you looking for a more theological or church ministry lens, I'd recommend these 3 books. Church 2 is a book, as you can guess, that's specific to church and ministry in the themes of Me Too. So talking about abuses of power and sexual assault, how those things are tied to purity culture and get perpetuated in our churches and communities. Breaking the Marriage Idol by one of my colleagues, Cutter Calloway, is a fantastic book. He is a theologian of culture, and so he gets into the ways that evangelical Christianity got really swept up in romance and marriage in a way that really mirrored culture, even though they were trying so hard to be countercultural. It's very fascinating look at media and its influence on the church and theology. And then finally, Faithful, which is by Beth Felker Jones, who is a theologian. And that's an exploration of how do we widen our theology of sexuality and faithfulness beyond just wait until marriage. How can we understand our sexualities and relationships in a larger way than that? So take a moment to take a photo of this, screenshot it if you need to. I can also email this information to anyone else who needs recommendations.